Hello and welcome to the show. I just want to take a quick moment to let you know that this show is original content and no AI is used in the production. The voice you hear narrating is mine, and I'm reading an original script. If you have any questions about the show, please leave them in the comments. Otherwise, enjoy. Environmentalism is a major hot topic all over the world today, and with good reason. After all, if the planet we live on is damaged by pollutants to the point it starts rebelling against us, it's not as if we have anywhere else to go. But while increased extreme weather phenomena and rising global temperatures are a problem we all have to deal with today, many people have come together and are making an effort to make our future brighter. Sometimes, though, the darkness takes over. In 1952, the City of London was attempting to combat a different issue altogether, albeit one that was caused by many of the same factors, and that was the Great Smog. Given it's always been such a major hub for world trade, it probably shouldn't come as a surprise London was heavily affected by the Industrial Revolution when it swept across the planet during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. After all, with the British Empire still going strong at that point, it was always going to be a nexus point for activity. That said, with the increase in things like factories and mills which were driven by coal-powered steam engines came a number of unfortunate side effects, one of the biggest of which was air pollution, and that's what led to dense fogs becoming a custom feature of life in the city. Fogs which under the right circumstances could mix with industrial smoke and morph into smog outbreaks known to the locals as pea soupers on account of their yellow-greenish color. Of course, it wasn't just industrial locations that were responsible for those instances of smog breaking out though. No, the general public also had their role to play as well. After all, with the population swelling on account of the need for workers to fill out the ever-increasing number of factories, it meant that by 1901, the sheer volume of people moving from more rural areas into the city had reached a critical mass. That created a situation where the 6 million people then living in London, a full fifth of the UK, were burning a lot of coal. Coal that was used to both heat fires and provide fuel for cooking. And as with the factories these people worked in, the smoke created from it had to go somewhere, with that somewhere ultimately being through chimneys and into the outside air. Because of that, those born in the city often became clearly distinguishable to outsiders by their unhealthy pallor, weak stature, and habit of talking with a distinctive accent, something which was affected by their need to breathe heavily through their mouths due to their congested nasal passages. The situation had gotten so bad that when the Anglo-Boer War broke out at the end of the 19th century, only 2 in 9 working-class male Londoners were found to be fully fit for combat, with others suffering from conditions ranging as far and wide as general skin issues, consumption, or even tuberculosis. As a matter of fact, TB and other lung diseases would be the biggest cause of death there during that period of time. So given the state of things, you'd be forgiven for thinking there was no possible way it could get any worse. But it could, and that's because on December 5th, 1952, a thick smog settled over the city that was worse than anything its inhabitants had ever seen before. Sure, there had been bad breakouts of pea soupers prior to that, such as when, in December of 1813, a smog reportedly smelling of coal tar blanketed the city for days and left people unable to see one side of the street from the other. And then there was the time a similar phenomenon struck in December of 1873 and led to the death rate across the city rising by 40%. But those were relatively small examples when compared to what took place around a century later as things reached a whole new level of deadliness. Basically, it all started the evening before when an anticyclone reached England, causing a temperature inversion which left a layer of cool, stagnant air close to the ground trapped under a warmer one. That meant any fumes pumped out into the atmosphere through industrial chimneys or people's houses at that time would also be trapped under that warmer layer, and as such would be allowed to mix with the fog to create a particularly deadly outbreak of smog. Why was it so deadly this time around? Well, it wasn't just smoke from chimneys and car exhausts that helped create it. It was also highly toxic pollutants such as sulfur dioxide, which were commonplace in the air by then. Pollutants which were found in things like diesel-fueled buses, which had recently replaced the city's electric tram system. Needless to say, when the 650-foot or 200-meter deep cloud began enshrouding London and its surrounding areas the following morning, it soon became a point of discussion.
It started on the 5th of December, and it went on getting worse until the 9th. Fog, rolling in from the sea, laid a blanket over the London area, a blanket so thick that the smoke couldn't get through it. The fog and smoke mixed together in a dark, yellow, choking mass. This was smog on the grand scale. There'd never been anything like it before, and there's not been one like it since. Not yet, anyway.
Not that the people understood the full danger of it quite yet, however. No, while they had seen things like that happen before and knew the effects it could have on the overall public health, they didn't initially view it as being any more than prior instances of smog. They still took great care to cover their mouths as much as possible as they were leaving for work that morning so they could breathe in as little of the sickly-looking miasma as they could. Most residents found that practice to be a hassle, but then it was part and parcel with living in the city by that point. Every Londoner knew it and accepted it as an occupational hazard. And anyway, it wasn't like full-blown smog outbreaks like that ever lasted longer than a day or two, so there wasn't much to be worried about in the long term. Except this time, the smog wouldn't clear after a day or two. No, as a result of both the anticyclone trapping pollutants and toxins in the air, and the lack of wind giving the smog no opportunity to be naturally dispersed, it carried on well into the second and third days. What's more, come day 3 it was clear that conditions weren't continuing at the same level. They were actually getting worse. By that point, noxious clouds had spread out to a full 30 miles or 48 kilometers in diameter and had developed a foul smell of rotten eggs. As if that wasn't bad enough, it had grown so dense that residents in some sections of the city were unable to see either their hands in front of their faces or their feet below them as they tried in vain to walk the streets. In the East End of London, in fact, the place that was hit hardest on account of it both housing a higher quantity of factories and being lower lying, anyone going outside quickly found their clothes, faces, and nostrils being blackened by a thick layer of soot. Even when many of them took to wearing improvised face masks outside, it did little good in the long run as this smog was so persistent it managed to penetrate people's homes through cracks in the walls and small gaps underneath doors. And it wasn't just people's homes the smog was getting into. No, theaters and cinemas also felt the brunt of it too. So it wasn't as if people could just go see a show in order to escape what was happening for a few hours as if they tried to do so. It would simply follow them there and obscure their view of whatever was happening. That's right, there was simply no escape from this particular outbreak. As day 3 turned into day 4, there continued to be no sign of it clearing. Seeing an opportunity, many of the criminals of the city took to looting stores and robbing people who dared to walk around outside at that point, something that was made much easier for them on account of the poor visibility hiding their identities. Why wouldn't people just use some safer method of transportation, such as a bus or train, when it was known thieves were wandering the streets incognito? Well, as it turned out, those other methods weren't as readily available anymore on account of the weather conditions. Because no one could see more than a foot in front of them, driving a vehicle or sailing a boat became next to impossible, and for that reason, many public transport services were outright cancelled, with those that did carry on doing so at great risk. Sure, the buses that were running tried their best to improve visibility by using flashlights or flares to light the way in front of them, but even then there was still a far higher than normal number of accidents. And the trains didn't fare much better either because, despite drivers inching forward at a snail's pace whenever they were moving, they still managed to miss signals and as a result, further incidents occurred. Then there's the havoc the Great Smog of London played on air travel as flights coming in and out of the city had to be either delayed or cancelled en masse for days. And with the capital being such a hub for flights, that meant people from all over the world were affected. The only thing that wasn't affected, in fact, was the famous London Underground, and the reason for that was it was so deep under the cobblestones the inhabitants of the city walked across daily, the smog was unable to breach it. Still, that didn't mean traveling by subway was without its issues, as it being the only viable method of getting somewhere in many cases. Thousands clogged up the ticket booths and platforms, with it leading to widespread delays as trains simply couldn't fit everybody in them at one time. Basically, the entire city had been brought to a complete standstill. Even soccer fixtures had to be called off as the players involved couldn't see well enough to even find the ball, let alone kick it into their opponent's goal. It is true that at least one sporting event, a cross-country competition between Oxford and Cambridge universities, did go ahead. But that was only barely manageable, and the only reason it was able to be carried out at all was because marshals were posted at regular intervals along the track to call out to the runners which way they should be headed. Outside of that, though, it simply wasn't feasible for anyone to function normally. And by day 4, children were even being advised to stay home from school as authorities feared they'd get lost in the blinding fog somewhere between there and their home and not be able to find their way back again. Children getting lost in the smog was not the only reason they were being encouraged to stay home, though. That was because the conditions were starting to cause a major rise in hospital admissions all around the city. But then why wouldn't it? After all, breathing in 5 days' worth of toxic fumes would have been enough to destroy anyone's lungs. And on top of that, the amount of folks slipping and falling on the greasy black ooze that had by then coated most of the sidewalks was causing even more to have to seek help from a doctor for their injuries. So it's just lucky then that on December 9th, as day 5 was drawing to a close, a brisk wind came in from the west and finally swept the smog away towards the North Sea, allowing people to see the city they called home for the first time in almost a week. Of course, in seeing the city again though, they could also now get a clear view of the damage that had been done to not only its people, but also some of its animal life. That's right, as a result of inhalation of toxic fumes, a whole host of previously healthy cattle at the Smithfield Show in Earl's Court had to be slaughtered to prevent them from suffocating due to the acute respiratory symptoms they were beginning to show. And as if that wasn't enough, a number of birds would also be found to have died after flying into buildings they couldn't see coming. But that was only the beginning of the health problems that would arise as a result of the 5-day-long outbreak. Though the full effects of it wouldn't be completely understood until a few weeks later when undertakers began to run out of coffins, something that had come about as a direct result of the amount of fatalities brought on by severe breathing problems. It had gotten so bad that instances of bronchitis and pneumonia in the immediate aftermath of the disaster actually went up by 70%. And when it came to the overall death rate, well, that would increase by a staggering 9-fold. And of the demographics that were most directly affected by it, young children, the elderly, and those with pre-existing respiratory problems would be hit the worst. Basically, the most vulnerable people in society. Of course, right behind them, smokers would find themselves affected at an abnormally high rate too. Something that was notable as cigarettes were very fashionable at the time, and so a large percentage of the population smoked regularly. That all created a situation where an estimated 4,000 people died prematurely in the weeks and months that followed. The initial 4,000 weren't the only people who could call themselves victims of the Great Smog of London, though, as the long-term effects on the respiratory systems of the citizens led to at least double that number passing away by the summer of the following year. And in recent years, after further scientific reassessment of what took place were carried out, some would even go as far as to suggest as many as 12,000 died as a direct result of what is now considered one of the worst environmental disasters in UK history. But for as bad as it all got, during the initial aftermath, the UK government was hesitant to make any direct connection between the smog and the amount of deaths that were being registered. In fact, they'd go as far as to blame an outbreak of influenza as being the likely culprit. Obviously then, that was their attempt to shift blame and not take accountability for their part in letting the conditions get the way they had. As the weeks went on and more information about the causes of deaths became known, however, it was clear such a virus couldn't have been the cause, leading them to backtrack and accept their role in the proceedings. As the chief medical statistician himself stated when asked about the smog soon thereafter, quote, The incident was a catastrophe of the first magnitude in which, for a few days, death rates attained a level that has only been exceeded on rare occasions during the past 100 years, as for example at the height of the cholera epidemic of 1854 and of the influenza epidemic of 1918 to 1919. Clearly then, something had to be done to stop another outbreak of deadly smog causing such havoc for the citizens of London again in the future. And that was why, in an attempt to make things right, Sir Hugh Beaver would be appointed by the government to chair a committee on air pollution. What would the findings of that committee be? Well, first of all, the major conclusion was that clean air should become an essential part of fuel policy going forward. And that meant smoke created by both industrial and domestic chimneys had to be cleaner and free from dangerous particles that could then be breathed in by anyone coming into contact with them. If that wasn't possible, then smoke should be eliminated entirely, either by using smokeless fuels or by changing to different methods of heating homes, such as electric or oil fires. Unfortunately, though, such things were a lot more expensive and far harder to come by back then. And that meant many people couldn't afford to have them installed or maintained. But that wouldn't be as big of an issue a few years later, as by then, after much pressure was placed on them to do something substantial about the problem, Parliament finally passed the Clean Air Act of 1956. An act that not only restricted the burning of coal in urban areas and authorized local councils to set up smoke-free zones, but also allowed for grants to be handed out to local homeowners which gave them the money they needed to convert their homes from coal heating systems to more modern methods. Of course, even with that act in place, transitioning one of the biggest cities in the world away from the old ways of doing things was still a tall task and wasn't going to be completed overnight. Hell, it still wouldn't be finished come 1962, the year another smog outbreak led to the deaths of around 750 people. That said, even if it was a slow process getting to where the city needed to be, it was still progress going in the right direction. And over time it would reach a point where the London of the post-war era and the London of the modern day were unrecognizable to each other, at least on the surface. Nowadays, deadly pea-colored smog blanketing the streets and killing thousands are a thing of the past. However, it doesn't mean there aren't still problems to be dealt with. And that's because, even if coal is no longer being burned en masse, sending toxic fumes into the air, things like car exhausts are still an issue. With the amount of vehicles that pass through the city every day as people commute to and from work, that can quickly lead to continued problems in terms of public health, as far less visible dangers are now being pumped into the atmosphere and breathed in by everyone. As Oliver Lord, the UK head of the Clean Cities campaign, said when questioned on the matter during the late 2010s, quote, "The Great Smog was so shocking, but air pollution is still with us today, and we must not be complacent just because we can't see it." While things aren't anywhere near as bad as they were during the Great Smog of 1952, by the dawn of the 2020s it was still estimated that around 9,000 people were dying in London prematurely every year on account of poor air quality created by pollutants in the air. So that was why Mayor Sadiq Khan began making plans to establish ultra-low emission zones within the city, something that was designed to build on the congestion charge first introduced in 2003, which forced motorists to pay a fee each time they drove in a specific area, theoretically preventing traffic from building up as much. That wasn't all that was being done to combat the problem, because the following year the UK government also announced its intention to be the first generation to leave the environment in a better state than in which we found it. And the way they were going to do that was to introduce the Environmental Act of 2021 in the wake of their exit from the European Union. What did that act entail? Well, according to its specific wording, the government of Britain would now be required to set binding targets on key environmental indicators, such as biodiversity protection, waste reduction, and air and water quality improvements. And in doing that, the hope was that they would meet those targets in due time and, in the process, bring the overall pollution of the air down, not just in London, but in every other industrial city too. Sadly though, as it stands today, it doesn't look like such targets are regularly being met. As Polly Billington, the chief executive of UK 100 Network, put it in fact, quote, "Toxic air is still a national health crisis. Poor air quality is linked to 3 times as many deaths as in 1952. Failure to tackle it is dereliction of duty on the grandest scale." Does that mean the people of London should be prepared for another outbreak of deadly pea-colored smog in the near future? Probably not. But in many ways, that's what makes the current situation arguably even more dangerous because, while what happened before was disastrous, at least it was clear for all to see. Nowadays, though, with the chemicals in the air being different, the Great Smog the City of London and other similar modern-day metropolises have to deal with is an invisible one. And unfortunately for us all, it's one which is no less deadly in the long run. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week when we'll take you somewhere sinister.